meeting link.
Okay, anybody who's got their, I don't want to mute all. And if I have to, Dr. Williams, that means I will, oh God. Okay, if I have to, I will, I'm still playing here with people, letting people in, so I apologize. Okay, we're going to start now. Good afternoon and welcome to Union Public Library. I'm Debbie Walter and I work in adult services, so I get to plan programs, which is great. One of the reasons it's great is we get to meet people like Dr. Hettie Williams, who is an assistant professor of history at Monmouth University and author, editor of 5 books on race and the history of African Americans. Her latest is Bury My Heart in a Free Land, Black Women Intellectuals in Modern US History. And she is currently working on a Black monograph, Women and the Civil Rights Movement in New Jersey. I'm so grateful to her for being here today and giving her time, and I thank you very much. Dr. Williams?
So I have to share screen. Let me share screen so that these can come up. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. Let me just do one more thing. Okay. So today I want to talk to you about the civil rights movement, and I have 3 themes that I want to cover in this presentation today. And let me just do that. So I want to talk about historiography for a few minutes. Then I want to talk about the personal as political. And then I would like to talk about Black women in struggle in New Jersey as a case study. So I know there are likely some historians on the call and maybe some students of history. So you would have heard about this phrase, historiography. And historiography is the history of history. And it's essentially what historians have already said about the past. But it's also a way for historians to perhaps revise what they have said about the past as new evidence comes to light. So historiography, the history of history, what I'll do here is just go over some histories or some books that have been written about the civil rights movement. To say that Black women led the civil rights movement is not a new claim. It is a claim that has been made by historians, at least for the last 20 years or more, that the civil rights movement involved Black women. We all know. The first name that comes to mind might be Rosa Parks or Ella Baker or Fannie Lou Hamer. And I'm going to guess that most of you on the call today have heard of, if not all 3 of those names, at least one of those names. And then I want to talk about the personal as political. And several historians and sociologists alike have discussed how the personal is political in the lives of not only Black women, but Black people more generally, as well as women more generally. And then thirdly, we will talk about this case study that I'm working on for a book that I'm working on about Black women in the civil rights movement in New Jersey. So the history of history, what have historians said about Black women in the civil rights movement, or more specifically, the civil rights movement in New Jersey? The personal as political, I invited some of my aunts from Georgia on the call. I'm hoping that they're able to and try to see if they're able to join the call, because my interest in the civil rights movement really came from their stories and the stories from my mom, who was active in the civil rights movement in Georgia in the 1960s. She actually marched in the 1961 Albany campaign. And so I can remember being a small child, about age 4 or 5, and my mom would tell us stories about how she marched in the civil rights movement. So that's where my interest in history came from. Both of my parents loved stories, and they always talked about stories of growing up in the Deep South. My dad was born in Alabama, and my mom was born in Georgia. So the personal as political. It's a personal matter when one's children are being assaulted in the street. It's a personal matter when one is being attacked in their homes, not just on the street. So this presentation today is dedicated to Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland. The personal is political, and then specifically looking at New Jersey. So, historiography, what has been the history of history? It sounds like a dry, boring subject because it's really just talking about the books that historians have written about the past, specifically the civil rights movement. A great deal of work has been done in this field. In fact, I think it's one of the most expansive fields in the study of US history. So, there are many books on this topic, obviously, written by historians. But in the 1980s, when most of the books about the civil rights movement were, of course, about Rosa Parks and or Martin Luther King Jr., primarily about Black men in the Black church who advanced the struggle for Black equality, you begin to see a discussion about something called the struggle for Black equality. And historians started to get more interested in conversations about how long African Americans have been struggling for freedom. Was the civil rights movement, in other words, a unique moment in the history of African Americans? Was it something new? Now, since the 1960s, historians have been concerned about the struggle for Black equality in terms of studying topics like the abolitionist movement. We know that obviously African Americans were involved in the abolitionist movement. And so African Americans have taken part in all of these major movements for human liberation. I would argue, in along with many historians that have said, African Americans have called this nation to conscience again and again over the matter of human liberation and have extended American democracy in doing so. And so it wasn't in the 1980s that historians discovered that African Americans have been fighting for human liberation. They were aware that African Americans are obviously involved in the abolitionist movement, but it is in the early 1980s that historians began to discuss something called the struggle for Black equality, and came to realize after the civil rights movement that African Americans had been demanding their freedom for uh, centuries, and
Yes.
that this is a struggle that is ongoing. There's a famous song called Ella's song, "We Who Believe in Freedom Cannot Rest." And so the notion of the struggle for freedom is etched into our identity and culture. And it has been ongoing since the first people of African descent arrived on these shores. So historians have begun to use this phrase, struggle for Black equality, and a book by a historian by the name of Harvard Sitkoff, The Struggle for Black Equality, in which he makes this claim that the civil rights movement is an important moment in African American history, but these struggles have been ongoing on a national and local scale. And so historians began to use this phrase, struggle for Black.
You could recycle it.
And so the struggle for Black equality has been ongoing since the founding of the Republic.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at this MLK, the fight for equality. So I'm going to be listening to this if you guys need me. Uber worked out. The guy's coming in
I'm
3
gonna
minutes.
stop.
So.
I'm gonna.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're bleeding more even. Yeah.
So the struggle for Black equality is ongoing, and we began to see books written in the 1990s. I've Got the Light of Freedom by Charles Payne. And in the Charles Payne book, Payne recognizes an organizing tradition. So in this book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, Payne is looking at Mississippi, and he's looking at individuals like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was active in the Mississippi struggle, and other local people that were overlooked.
Mommy's got an interview at 2:30. When you're done class, you can't make noise, nothing. You understand? You're going to go in there.
In the 1980s and 1990s, books about the civil rights movement tended to continue to focus.
Dr. Williams, I'm going to mute all the participants and then I will unmute you. So
Okay.
let me do that.
Okay.
I do want you at 6 o'clock, because at 7 o'clock, at 7 o'clock, we have a nice program.
Okay. Are we good? Okay, so the struggle for Black equality then is happening on a national scale and it's happening on a local scale. It's happening in places like Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia. And most of us know about the struggle for Black equality in the South. And so in the 90s and the early 2000s, it's really in the early 2000s that we start to get books that look at the civil rights movement in the North. Racism was a national problem. It was not only a problem that was apparent in the South. So historians looking at the struggle for Black equality began to identify what was known as the organizing tradition, a tradition of organizing, a tradition of petitioning, boycotting, and then writing about and demanding their freedom. And so these two terms, struggle for Black equality, focus on men, struggle for Black equality, the organizing tradition. And it's under this notion of the organizing tradition that historians began to look at the participation of women. So in the mid 1990s, early 2000s, you start to get more books about the participation of women. And it's historians like Barbara Ransby, China Kai Lee, and more recently, Danielle McGuire, who have come to make the claim that the civil rights movement was a women's movement. And again, the first few names that I started with, Rosa Parks, for instance, everybody knows the name of Rosa Parks. And I think most of us know the name of Fannie Lou Hamer. China Kai Lee's book is about Fannie Lou Hamer, a working class woman who demanded the right to vote. And so China Kai Lee's book in 1999 was important because she's looking at a woman who was a grassroots organizer and leader in the civil rights movement. And so For Freedom's Sake is more or less a social biography of Fannie Lou Hamer and her activities in Mississippi. Fannie Lou Hamer gives a famous speech in Atlantic City at the Democratic National Convention demanding the right to vote, but also talking about her personal story. So here's where I get into the personal is political. If you go to YouTube, you can type in Fannie Lou Hamer's name and you can hear her speech for yourself. It's a very powerful speech in which she discusses her personal story, and she weaves her personal story into the politics of Black liberation. And so Fannie Lou Hamer is talking about, in this particular speech, in other speeches, the assault on her body for the attempt she made to vote. And the assault on her body was harshly physical. she was severely beaten, along with several other people who were trying to register to vote. And she has a very powerful voice. Her voice is as powerful a voice as King. Lyndon Baines Johnson was so afraid of Fannie Lou Hamer speaking on the TV that he called for an impromptu press conference because
Okay. It says about the struggles here.
he knew that the news
It's showing the struggles in
would
women.
cover
Showing
him
pictures.
instead
At
of
the bottom, it says,
Fannie Lou
wait
Hamer.
a minute, something is at the bottom. Let me see what it says.
So Fannie Lou
Oh,
Hamer
this one off. Wait a
probably
minute.
a name that
There's
most
something at the bottom. Hold a minute. Let me see.
Dr. Williams, I'm sorry to interrupt again. Would everyone please turn off their phones? On my list, I've muted everybody. So if you're not muted, please turn off your phone. Thank you.
okay. So
I have another call coming in. 1 moment.
Okay, now I can see. I can see.
okay. So Fannie Lou Hamer is well known probably to most of you. She rises to the national spotlight, and LBJ is so afraid of her being on TV during her speech at the National Democratic Convention that he calls an impromptu press conference so that she would not be seen on everyone's television. So that's a well-known story. So it's in the 90s, early 2000s that historiography, the history of history, begins to really take off when it comes to the role of women in the civil rights movement. So you get historians writing around this time who are making this argument that women were important to the civil rights movement, Black women in particular. A stunning book, At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape and Resistance, a new history of the civil rights movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power by Danielle McGuire in 2010. This is a text that written by McGuire, who makes a direct claim that the civil rights movement was not only advanced by Black women, it was a movement of Black women because it had to be. Black women who were concerned about their the assault on their bodies, and particularly rape. And so McGuire says that Black women had to lead this movement because it was a personal matter of the assault on their bodies. And so what McGuire identifies in her book is the fact that Black women are being attacked and raped with regularity, and that it was a matter of personal survival that the civil rights movement began and was led by Black women. Now, coming to New Jersey in the history of African Americans in New Jersey, more recently, scholars, about 2005, scholars began to look at the civil rights movement in the North. The civil rights movement did not only happen in the South, it also happened in Northern communities. And this is about 2005, Jacqueline Dowd Hall, the historian who writes The Long Civil Rights Movement. And she is making this argument, the struggle for freedom has an organizing tradition that goes beyond 54 to 68. And it is also happening in the North. Kamosi Woodard, Jean Veal Harris, writing their edited volume, Freedom North, about the civil rights movement in the North. So it's about 2005 that you start to see historians begin to focus on the civil rights movement in the North. And so my colleague, Dave Grayson, wrote a book called Suburban Erasure, How the Suburbs Ended the Civil Rights Movement in New Jersey. And it's really the first major comprehensive history of African Americans in New Jersey in the 20th century. And in this book, Dr. Grayson identifies the fact that the civil rights movement has so much promise in New Jersey and involved Black women. And so it's an important book about not only the civil rights movement in New Jersey, but suburbanization and how the suburbs ended the struggle for equality in New Jersey. So Dr. Grayson is identifying a movement that's taking place not only in the North, but specifically in New Jersey. More recently, Black women's Christian activism seeking a social justice in the northern suburb by Betty Livingston Adams is the first major survey of Black women, scholarly survey of Black women in the history of New Jersey. And looking at suburbanization, but also looking at the early struggle for equality in New Jersey involving women such as Florence spearing Randolph and Violet Johnson. And so Dr. Adams is looking at women, particularly in Summit, New Jersey, but also talking about how these women were national figures in a larger national movement. And so consider the dates on these two books. 2012, really the first comprehensive history of African Americans in New Jersey in the 20th century. There's a lot of work on African Americans in the colonial era, great deal of work. But looking at African Americans in the 20th century is more recent in terms of scholarly books. So my point in looking at the history of history is to demonstrate to you that historians have collected a body of evidence and they have made claims about the civil rights movement in the North. And there's a body of literature and evidence in which I build on today to look at New Jersey as a case study. My question that I raise is in part historiographical. In other words, I'm interested in the history of history about civil rights, and more particularly about Black women's intellectualism. So for me, I argue that I take a new approach in that I'm looking at the history of ideas. What ideas did these Black women have about human liberation and human freedom? My field is particularly intellectual history. Most of the histories about the civil rights movement have been social histories. So looking at social group organization and social activism, my book and what I try to do is look at Black women and their ideas along with their social activism. And so I am drawing upon a literature, a body of literature and work that has been advanced by many historians. And I'm really making a claim about the state of New Jersey in particular, with a focus on the interwar era, roughly between 1919 and 1949. So it's somewhat extended beyond the interwar era.
Yes.
My second theme, the personal is political. I discussed a little bit of it at the beginning when I said the stories of the civil rights movement really come from my mom and her sisters who participated in the Albany movement. I remember being around 5 years old and my mom, Gloria, telling me about the fact that she was 18 years old when she was willing to die for human liberation, because she was active in the Albany movement that took place roughly between 1961 and 1962. And so the personal was political for Fannie Lou Hamer. It's personal when someone breaches the boundaries of your home and attempt to kill you. It's personal when someone snatches your children off the street and lynches them. So women have had a vested interest in advancing human freedom because of their concern not only for the home and for their children, but believing that the emancipation of Black women would free the nation. And so it's no mistake that we see Black women calling the nation to conscience at the present. Women such as Stacey Abrams and Natasha Brown. This is a long history. It's a long tradition of fighting back. And so the personal is political when mothers tell their daughters the story of the fight that they waged that must be passed down We who believe in freedom cannot rest. A song for Ella Baker, who was a well-known organizer, worked with Martin Luther King, and in fact was the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and was known to be an organizer and national leader, plays a hand in the creation of SNCC as well. So looking at New Jersey in particular, many women come to mind. This presentation is for Union County Library, and I'm sure everybody at Union County Library has certainly heard of Florence Randolph and her work in Summit, New Jersey at the turn of the century. So other historians have written about Black women in the Black church. Where did Black women learn their organizing skills? They learned about organizing and leadership within the Black church, although within the context of the Black church, many Black women were not given leadership roles. But think to yourself, who's organizing the bake sale? Who's organizing the speaker series? Who's raising money for the speakers that come to the church? It's the women. And in 1993, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, in her important book, Righteous Discontent, the women's movement in the Black Baptist Church from 1880 to 1920, identifies first Black church women. Now, we have many histories of Black church men, like Martin Luther King, for instance, and Ralph Abernathy, right? There were Black women in those churches who were also, although they were not allowed to occupy leadership positions, they were also there organizing. And through ladies' auxiliaries, for instance. And so Florence Randolph is one of those women who comes out of the AME Zion tradition, who's organizing and becomes a national figure in the early 20th century. And she's one of the women who really lays the foundation for the civil rights movement in New Jersey. And Dr. Adams has a book that discusses her. And it's an important book. Again, the first book on Black women in the history of New Jersey, the first major scholarly text just 4 years ago. So there's a lot of work to be done by scholars looking at the civil rights movement, and particularly in New Jersey. And this is an image of Florence Randolph on the right. So with all of that knowledge that I grew up with as a scholar and just reading about the civil rights movement, I argue in my particular work that the civil rights movement involved a lot of women. In fact, the women were leading, as many historians have already claimed. But I take this argument further and argue that the civil rights movement, not only was it led by women and happening in the North, it was started by women in a northern state called New Jersey. And so what I do in this book is I take profiles of women and the institutions that they built, such as the Montclair YWCA, which I don't really discuss in this particular presentation, but there are a series of books that do mention the Montclair YWCA that began in 1912. And it was an organizing ground in many respects for women to learn and gain leadership skills, right? It was also a cultural institution, right? Where major figures of the Harlem Renaissance came to Montclair, New Jersey, right? So Sara Spencer Washington is one of these women that I profile in the book. And Sara Spencer Washington was among a contingent of Black women, including Florence Randolph, founder of New Jersey Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, Mary Allen, Hortense Ridley Tate, a co-founder of the National Council of Negro Women, Bessie Marsh, and Anna Arnold Hedgeman, who made the civil rights movement successful in the North. So what I do here is I profile these women who were either born in New Jersey or came to New Jersey as a result of the Great Migration. Sara Spencer Washington came to New Jersey roughly in the early 20th century, first settled in Pennsylvania, came to New Jersey, started a business, a hair care and beauty product line, but she established an empire in Atlantic City, essentially, that included a news service, magazine, beauty products, beauty services, a school, a golf club, a rest home, a beauty pageant, and under the guise of Apex Beauty. It was a global business. Not only was it in 12 states, it was also in the Caribbean as well as South Africa. She was a club woman. She was involved in the National Association of Colored Women, NAACP, the Black Republican Club. She was known for her philanthropy and her activities and giving her money and her wealth. She was worth $1 million or more at the time of her death. You probably all know the story of Madam C.J. Walker. She essentially was similar to Madam C.J. Walker in that she built a Black hair care business and beauty services, as well as training women to own their own businesses. And so she also used her wealth to purchase the Brigantine Hotel, which led to the integration of the boardwalk. Atlantic City Public Library has a collection of papers and photographs of Sarah Spencer Washington. From my understanding, there is a documentary that I believe it's her great grandson that has developed a documentary of her life. I believe there are at least 1 or 2 scholarly books in the works about her life. When I was working on my dissertation at the time, there was no documentary or book on her life, and she's still obscure to some people. She gets overlooked because of Madam C.J. Walker's more recognizable. Annie Malone is more recognizable. These were 2 other Black women who were developing hair care, the hair care products at the same time. And but Sarah Spencer Washington set up her business in Atlantic City. And Atlantic City subsequently became a center of the Black freedom struggle in New Jersey. But she was a club woman also who moved between these different clubs. She was well known. This is just an image of her too. This is taken from one of her pamphlets. She was known to be somewhat of a micromanager. She wrote pamphlets and articles in her magazines and distributed them from door to door. In these pamphlets, though, she's making arguments towards Black women's empowerment. There is a part of one of these pamphlets where she's writing about skin bleaching, which was controversial and continues to be controversial, whether or not to use the beauty products to lighten your skin. And she says at one point, it's never good to erase your natural features completely. This is not a good thing. Be happy and proud of your natural looks. And so she gets criticized because obviously she's selling some of these products, but I'm saying that she's an organic intellectual. And what I mean by that, she is a person who's self-taught and self-made, but is producing knowledge through these pamphlets that she's writing and giving advice to Black women about how to gain, self-empowerment through the beauty culture business. But at the same time, she's talking about personal identity along with personal care. The personal is political. This is one of the graduating classes of Apex Beauty Schools in 1946. If you read closely, she continuously would tell these young women, now is the time, right, to establish yourself as an independent woman, is essentially what she's saying in these pamphlets. Take control of your future. Now is the time. This is an image of Apex Beauty from 1976. And eventually the business, she passes away in 1953, and the business is turned over to her adopted daughter and descendants, and it eventually goes out of business. This is Sarah Spencer here at the golf club, Apex Golf Club, right? But now is the time to plan for your future is a phrase that she often used in her pamphlets, in her speeches, in the talks that she gave. And so she is speaking to Black women's empowerment through these pamphlets and giving them ideas about how to advance themselves. And so this has long been a part of the organizing tradition, self-empowerment. So in these pamphlets, I argue, you find messages of self-empowerment. Not only messages of self-empowerment, but she's also involved in the larger national struggle for human liberation, as well as in New Jersey, by helping to integrate the beachfront. The next woman I profile is Anna Arnold Hedgeman. Anna Arnold Hedgeman lived nearly 100 years. She was born in the Midwest in Anoka, Minnesota at the turn of the century. And she was very active in the YWCA. She graduated, she's the first Black person to graduate from Hamline University. And she goes off to teach, she wants to teach. And so she goes to the American South and she confronts racism in a serious way, really for, the first time in her life. And she realizes the inequality that is brought by segregation. She writes 2 books about her experiences. Let the Trumpet Sound is one of those books that she writes. If you look at the image of Anna Arnold Hedgeman, you could see that she has a light complexion. And in her memoirs, she discusses her father likely passed as white because he had such a light complexion. They grew up in an all-white town in Anoka, Minnesota. And she also discussed how her sisters were beautiful blondes. And so it was a family with very light complexion, with some family members who could pass. And so Anna Arnold Hedgeman is one of those individuals who happens to have this light complexion, but at the same time, she does give her life to the struggle for Black equality, nonetheless trying to navigate and negotiate issues such as complexion, class, gender. But much of her early career was spent with the YWCA and working with groups like the National Council of Churches, the NAACP, the Fair Employment Practices Committee. But when she was an executive with the YWCA, she traveled across much of the country and at one point is an executive director in Jersey City, New Jersey. And in my survey, she is probably one of the most important of the women for her national stature. And she was known to organize Black women, working class Black women through the YWCA in Jersey City. She actually disguises herself as a laundry woman so that she can figure out what their concerns were in the laundry. The YWCA did not particularly like this idea so much, at least in the 1920s when she was in the Jersey City YWCA in late 1920, 1927. And she's trying to organize working class women and trying to organize across class and racial divide. And she tries to do this in Jersey City, and it was frowned upon. She eventually finds herself in New York, and the New York YWCA, the Harlem YWCA, and she begins to organize women there. She takes part in the Don't Buy Where You Can't Sell campaigns in New York City. I would even say she's one of the architects of the Don't Buy Where You Can't, Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaigns. And so she is an important figure, I think, in the national civil rights movement that gets overlooked. When I was working on my dissertation, Jennifer Scanlon's book came out, Until There Is Justice. And it's the only book that I'm aware of, scholarly book, that gives full attention to the life of Anna Arnold Hedgeman. Hedgeman is important because she's organizing with A. Philip Randolph in the labor movement. And when A. Philip Randolph threatens to march on Washington, it was known as the March on Washington movement in the 1940s during World War II. And Franklin Roosevelt, president, said, well, we don't want you to do that. We'll give you some concessions. Let's create this committee, Fair Employment Practices Committee. Because at the time, African Americans were demanding equal rights in the defense industry. So they were demanding, jobs, right? And so Hedgeman had this long history of organizing women in the laundry centers and the working with working class women. And so when FEPC was created at the federal level, the Federal Employment Practices Commission is created. Randolph says, I need you with me, Anna Arnold Hedgeman, right? And she's the only woman on the committee to organize the March on Washington in 1963. My argument when it comes to Black women's ideas about human liberation is that Anna Arnold Hedgeman is a pluralist interracialist. And what I mean by this is she eventually leaves the YWCA. When she arrives in Harlem, she declares in her memoirs that she didn't want to speak to white people anymore. She was intensely angry about what was happening in the country, the segregation she faced when she traveled to do the business of the YWCA and having to stay in segregated, hotels and finding it difficult to just move around the country as a Black woman. And so she is one of the architects of the March on Washington movement. And again, why A. Philip Randolph wants her at his side to organize the March on Washington in 1963 that we all know about, involving Martin Luther King. And so I just wrote a chapter for an edited volume about Anna Arnold Hedgeman. And in that chapter, I talk about her as a pluralist interracialist. And I argue that we need a new language to talk about the Black freedom struggle and the ideas that flourished out of this struggle. A pluralist is someone perhaps who is committed to Black leadership, Black-led groups and organizations. And so there's an element of separatism in their view. Hedgeman does declare herself to be a Black nationalist for some years, but I argue she never gives up on the idea of interracial cooperation. She was always an interracialist, while at the same time espousing ideas about Black nationalism. She was still a member of the YWCA movement, and she was still committed to working a class the racial divide. And so we need this language, I believe, to talk about individuals who moved between several organizations, whether they were a member of Garvey's movement, which was essentially a Black nationalist movement, versus the integrationist movement that was led by the NAACP. She worked with all of these groups, is my argument, while at the same time committed to Black self-empowerment and Black leadership, without completely discounting cooperation with white women and white men through the churches. She was a Methodist and believed in this notion of good works. And she never gives that up. She's a staunch Methodist. She always is. But in her memoir, she's talking about the struggle she has with segregation and white supremacy. And so an idea that I advance in my writings about her is the notion of the pluralist interracialist. And that's essentially a person who straddles several groups at the same time while espousing the need for Black-led organizations. In terms of the Black separatist, I argue that somebody like Elijah Muhammad is really a separatist pluralist. I've spoken to in his granddaughter about his ideas regarding Black nationalism. And she said, well, his ideas were closer to something more like a pluralist vision where African Americans control their own communities, their own stores, and their own schools. But I would argue that he's not a territorial nationalist in the sense that his vision is more separatist, pluralist in nature. So, as an intellectual historian, I argue we need a new language to talk about individuals who straddle several groups and organizations. Marion Thompson Wright is the last woman I profile, and she's probably well known to those of you from Northern New Jersey because she's born in North Jersey, and she is more a classical intellectual where she gains a PhD. She's known by most historians to be the first woman trained in the US to earn a PhD in historical studies. But she's also claimed to be a social scientist. She's actually inventing social history, the new social history. She's one of the architects of that. And she's a historian who's doing work on the issue of segregation. In her dissertation at Columbia Teachers College, she's working with Merle Curdy, who's one of the great historians of the era, who is actually inventing intellectual and social history, and he's training her in the field. Her research actually becomes the basis later for the Brown versus Board of Education case because she's looking at segregation as it still existed in New Jersey. New Jersey had a law against segregation in schools that goes back to 1881. What Thompson identifies in her dissertation is New Jersey was still practicing segregation in the schools and that this was wrong and it had to stop. And it ultimately culminates in the case of Hedgepeth Williams versus Trenton Board of Education. In the center here, you see Robert Queen, who's a major member of NAACP, and he's a leader with the NAACP in Trenton, New Jersey, where in Trenton, New Jersey schools would segregate students between schools. Asbury Park would segregate students within the schools. And so you had New Jersey schools that were still segregating people, even though this law from 1881 said that this was against the law. So Queen takes the case of these two mothers to the New Jersey Supreme Court, and eventually the New Jersey Supreme Court rules on their behalf and says that segregation in New Jersey schools must stop. This is the first precedent before the Brown versus Board of Education case involving Black children almost a decade before Brown versus Board. Marion Thompson Wright does the historical research for litigation in this case, and she does the historical research for litigation in the Brown case. And this is an image of the two mothers and their children, right? So what I argue is the civil rights movement begins in New Jersey, but it doesn't obviously end segregation and racial conflict in the state. You have the case of the Scottsboro case of the North, the Trenton 6 case, right, which has been written about by some historians. And so the civil rights movement continues, but what happens in New Jersey is New Jersey gets a new constitution in 1947. And in this new constitution, an end to segregation in the New Jersey State National Guard, you begin to see the New Jersey Constitution is calling for the end of segregation. And the NAACP records indicate that the national NAACP is looking at New Jersey, and they're wanting to know how was this possible in New Jersey and how they might make this a blueprint for a larger national movement against Jim Crowism. So you get New Jersey Constitution, you get the New Jersey Civil Rights Act of 1949. You see Otto Hill here and other members of the New Jersey branch of the NAACP and the governor. And Otto Hill was a medical doctor from Northern New Jersey, and he was very instrumental in getting many of these laws passed. I just want to leave some time for questions. This is where I'm trying to sort of wrap things up. So this is kind of where I make that argument that Black women were at the center, and the Black women led the civil rights movement. It's a long movement for freedom, and it was about personal dignity identity, self-empowerment. But again, the movement also involved children, the murder of children like Emmett Till and Tamir Rice more recently. Of course, Black women are going to be at the helm of this movement. It makes perfect sense. And as we look at the books written by so many historians about the role of women, what I am saying is that we need to look at Black women and the ideas they advance, not just what they did, right? Their activism, but what ideas are they advancing about human liberation? And a major idea is in intersectionality, that in order for all people to be free, right, we must also think about women, because Black women are caught up in what's called a double bind. They're experiencing racism and sexism at the same time. So they came to advance this idea of intersectionality, right? Race, gender, right? Class were important to the advancement of human liberation. So these Black women are always turning to interracial coalition, cross-racial coalition, cross-class coalition building. And those ideas come from Black women. And to down to the present, where you see women such as LaTosha Brown and co-founder of Black Voters Matter, and Stacey Abrams, founder of New Georgia Project, co-founder of Fair Fight and New Georgia Project. And so going back to my dedication of this talk to Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland, it is a personal matter when your children are being slaughtered in the street. Is it a personal matter when the police are breaking down your doors and shooting you in your home? The personal is political. Thank you.
Very much, Dr. Williams. I appreciate it. Can you stop sharing your screen so we can see you while you answer questions?
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
So does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask at this time? And you can put the question in the chat box, or you can raise your hand if you have that ability. Also, I will try to unmute everybody for a moment and see if that works. But if it gets too crazy, then I'm going to have to stop that feature. So Dr. Williams, can you tell us about your own experiences, what you remember from your mother talking to you on a personal level, as you say?
So yeah, I was hoping that some of my aunts, what they were texting me and I couldn't answer because they were trying to get in. But I was hoping that maybe one of them might be here to talk about the work of Black women in the Black church and how there's a connection between and the fact that Black women are organizing within the church, although they're not giving leadership positions, nonetheless, they're being trained to organize. Yeah. And they take those organizational skills and they apply them to their social activism outside of the church. And so my mom was a church woman and she was very active in her church. And the stories she told me were about, Albany, the Albany campaign, in which Martin Luther King came to Albany, Georgia to try and organize the people of Albany. And there's actual footage of my mom walking to the church in one of the Albany movement videos on YouTube. I got to track that video down, but you could actually see it. And I told my sisters, hey, that's mommy. So that's where my love of history came from. My parents really telling me stories about their life growing up in the South, and why that song, Ella's song, if you haven't, I'm sure most of you know that song, We Who Believe in Freedom Cannot Rest, is written for Ella Baker and is taken from the words of Ella Baker, who was an organizer and a major civil rights leader. And in the song, it talks about, composed by Bernice Johnson Reagan, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. The struggle gets passed down to a new generation. So I feel like in telling me those stories, my mom was passing down the struggle to me, which we are still engaged in at the present.
Right. Someone is just asking about your latest books and what about the work on your latest book. And I think We may have another question here, but the woman in the orange sweater with the iPhone, she needs to unmute herself if she has a question.
Okay, so my new book, so this is work looking at the profiles of these women, which I didn't get into a lot of. I felt I was talking too fast here, but what I do is, so the book is called Garden of Opportunity: Black Women in the Civil Rights Movement in New Jersey. I focus roughly on 1919 to 1939, mostly the interwar era, and I talk about these women and their ideas, such as Hedgeman. There's a chapter on Hedgeman. There's a chapter on Spencer, and there's also a chapter on Marion Thompson Wright. I include some conversation about Florence Spearing, but the book is really about the 20th century activism of these women. And so Rutgers University Press is the press, and hopefully it'll be out soon. The pandemic has really created a an issue with me getting to archives, but yes. Somebody asked a question about the images from New Jersey Afro-American. So those are from the Urban Color Population Commission collection at the New Jersey State Archives. You do have, and I would recommend Newark Public Library for New Jersey Afro-American. I think they have a few of those copies of New Jersey Afro-American. So I would say try there perhaps. Yeah, Betty Livingston Adams, somebody mentioned her book, Betty Livingston Adams' book, you should pick up. 2016, it was published, is Black Women's Christian Activism. And she focuses on Northern New Jersey and the work of Florence Spearing Randolph. But I would say that that's an important book because it's the first scholarly book on Black women in New Jersey. And it was only published 4 years ago. So that book's foundational.
Roxanne is saying, in your look at ideas and not just activism, how have the ideas changed over time? For example, there's intersectionality. Are there more examples of these ideas, of something ideas and subsequent activism changed? And Roxanne, you can unmute yourself if you want to.
I think that's a great question. So what I'm trying to argue, because I don't think we have the language. I think our language is still too dichotomous, in which we look at Black separatists and Black integrationists, right? We have these two camps. These were the Black nationalists over here, and they were in the UNIA, and they were Black Muslims. They were in these groups, and they stayed. That's not really true, because you have, for instance, you have members of the NAACP are dusting off their rifles in the evening, right? And they're protecting themselves, and they're militants. They're militants at night, and they're integrationists during the day. And we have to get at those stories, I think, and I think the women that I look at, like Anna Arnold Hedgeman, kind of like bridges the gap between the integrationist and the separatist, because she says, I don't like white people, I'm not talking to them anymore, but she's still in the YWCA when she says that, and it's in the late 20s, early 30s, and right, she's still making overtures. She claims to not have talked to a white person for 5 years, so it's roughly between 27 and 33. But I argue that when you look at the record, she never really gives up on interracialism, which is cross-racial cooperation. So I think we got to get at these personal stories and think about the ideas. Deborah Gray White points out in Too Heavy a Load that, Black women were not always they were not always organizing across class. I mean, you have groups like Girlfriends Incorporated, you have Black elite organizations and associations, right? So to get at that story of the level of intersectionality in terms of how much were Black women actually organizing across race, gender, and class, how consistent it was over time, I think is a good question that I'm trying to get at by developing language to talk about these women, like for instance, the pluralist interracialist. I don't think anybody else has used that language. I'm using the language in a chapter that I just wrote on Hedgeman. Charlotta Bass, same thing. She's in the UNIA and the NAACP, and she's the editor of the California Eagle. So I don't think human beings function that way. Is my point. I think we're always changing our ideas and moving across sections. I don't think this person's a separatist and only a separatist at this time. But
Okay. I think that was, I don't know if Roxanne has a follow-up question. Okay, we have another question about whether, and I apologize for not pronouncing it right, Macleod Bethune will be in your next book. And just before you answer that question, I'm going to get my commercial in for Union Public Library, which is, if you haven't, I don't know, some of you entered without signing in, which is fine. We're thrilled you're here. If you could put your emails in the chat box, or I put my email in the chat box, if you could write to us and let us know your email, we can keep you informed of what's coming on next. And for instance, and I should have told you this ahead of time, Dr. Williams, that Dr. Greason is going to come on February 2nd and talk about history of race relations in Union County. And so we have programs on everything from that to Sinatra to crafts, meditation. We have the Mediterranean diet. We have a lot of different programs. If you don't feel comfortable signing up for our newsletter, check our website. So please, if you could answer the question about Ms. Bethune, that would be great. And then there's another question.
So yeah, there is a chapter where I look at the Black club women. So Bethune and Burroughs and all the Black club women are discussed in this particular chapter at the beginning of the book, where I'm talking about Black club women at the turn of the century. And I have a good friend who's working on Black women's Christian activism and Black women in the club movement, and does more work than I do with Bethune. I really focus on New Jersey. I wanted to get at looking at New Jersey as the state as a whole, not just a community or a county. I wanted to look at the entire state and then where the state fit in the larger story. I see a question about trauma passing down. I think trauma comes with it. I think that psychologists talk about this whole notion of inherited phobias and things. I'm not a psychologist, but psychologists talk about that, right? And I think trauma, so many historians have begun to look at trauma. And I think definitely that happens, because a part of the conversation is you have to be careful out there. It's not just you have to fight. You have to fight, but you have to be careful out there. And so what does that do to a young person who's 5 years old and learning about the struggle for Black equality? And right, I think our mothers prepared us to fight. You're going to have to fight. You're going to be the next generation who has to fight this. And so I think this trauma that's happening in that interchange, it's like inherited trauma, right? Unless we end racism, right? Yeah. We all have to work together to end racism, to end trauma.
Someone would like to know, I think you see the same question. They're also asking about how to pass down the struggle.
Right, and how do you pass down the struggle without inflicting trauma?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think, I don't know. I don't think that's, because I mean, looking at my own experience, my mom was a fighter and she said, you got to fight, but she's also was optimistic about the future. That you have to fight for yourself. She taught me how to become a fighter. She taught me how to be a fighter. But that doesn't come without trauma. So I don't know that the only thing that's going to cure that trauma is to end racism. And then we're all in this together. And I think that's why Black women kept going back to interracialism. Even though they declared their anger towards whites. Human liberation means to free Black people, to free women, to free white people in the process. and they kept going back to that model of activism.
So we have a question from Elizabeth Higginbotham, who I'm wondering if she's a relative. Great talk. I think people's views can change as they move in different spaces, especially workplaces. There are tensions that come from working across racial lines, so I think people can need a pause.
I agree with that. And I think it happens. I think with most of what we've written about the civil rights movement was first dichotomous, but much more historians are getting at a more nuanced interpretation where we recognize that we know there's a great deal of work about Martin Luther King and carrying a firearm, and the fact that when these kids come down to Georgia, like my grandfather, in Albany and the Sylvester areas where my parents grew up, or where my mom grew up, he always had a gun on the dashboard. When I came down there, I would notice guns, and I was like, "What's going on?" And then, people were ready to fight. But I don't think Black people are broken by the trauma. I think Black people are human, like anyone else, right? Despite it all.
Does someone have a question they want to ask and need me to unmute them? If you can somehow indicate that. I don't know if 2004 wants me to unmute her or him. I also want to thank, I'm going to get to the thanks, but the program we're having on February 2nd is going to be co-sponsored by Union Historical Society, Vauxhall Historical Society, and Union County Historical Society. So I just wanted to get that in there. Is there anyone else who has a question? Or Dr. Williams, is there anything else you'd like us to know about?
I think what I would say is, looking at African American history, I never want to present it as a story of mere victimization. These are people who are fighting back despite the trauma and despite their circumstances. It has an impact on them, obviously, but I think that it's a struggle for freedom, and they never give up despite it all. It's the story that I'm trying to get at anyway.
I think we are all inspired and encouraged, and reading the chat's messages, you'll see that people are very appreciative that you came today, Dr. Williams, as are we at the library, as we are that all of the participants participated. So thank you for that. And I appreciate Dr. Williams and wish everybody a good day. If you have other questions that you want to ask, I would suggest you email me, and I put the email in the box in the chat, and you'll see it there, and I will get them to Dr. Williams. So thank you again to everybody.
Thank you all for coming today.